Welcome to Quilter's Architect. My name is Mark. In this video, I'm continuing my work on the My 9 Lives Sampler Quilt. And today I'm working on block number 9, the last block in the sampler. You can see that the block name is Crossroads. And this is a fairly straightforward block. Has a few more pieces than a few of the other simpler blocks. And this is using the country fabric and dusty fabric from the quilt pattern. Well, given that in this video series, I've been sharing one of my near-death experiences and relating it to each of these blocks, you might wonder why the block Crossroads. Well, let me explain something that happened that I kind of related to Crossroads, like crossing paths with people who have different values or a totally different outlook on life, and how sometimes we know that can be good. It can open up our eyes to things we're not aware of. But other times, if some of those values or ethics are not so good, it cannot be very favorable to us. And so this goes back to my work at Irby Construction Company, the Powerline Company. And in this work, I was they called it a back bolter. And it's a type of lineman, but you didn't work with live electricity. You climbed the towers, and they were up to 225 foot tall. They were made of steel. These towers, if you've seen those out, that are carrying a transmission line, they have all this steel lacing that forms the structure of the tower. And for all of those pieces of steel lacing and the junction plates of steel beams, there's all these bolts, and those bolts all have to be torqued to a certain torque or tightened a certain amount, and all that lacing has to be properly placed. So our job was to go from the very ground to the very top and check every one of those bolts and pieces of steel lacing. Occasionally, we would get a second crew that wouldn't have anything to do, that did the same thing as us. Usually, we never worked on the same power line tower with a different crew. Each crew worked on their own job site. But on this particular day, there was no work for this other crew. I don't remember what happened. I don't remember the work we were doing got ahead of the other work, so there wasn't enough work for everyone. So the job manager decided to send a second crew to our tower. Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this other crew, but it's just the way people are. I'm not trying to be disparaging to anyone who makes certain choices, but they were known as the Doobie Brothers. Well, why did we call this work crew the Doobie Brothers? Because we frequently would be driving down the road to our job site, and they were going in the same direction because they're just on another tower or two over usually, right? And we would come across their truck sitting on the side of the road. They weren't at the job site yet. They would have a sign out, men working, but the truck would be all smoky. And the reason it was all smoky inside is because they had the reputation of smoking marijuana. And it wasn't me. I didn't originate this name. The guys around that worked around them, they called them the Doobie Brothers. And so they had that reputation. They all worked together, and it was working for them, evidently, and nothing had happened. But everyone else was kind of leery of them because I don't know about you, but I found that I've never experimented with drugs, but I had a relative who did. And he told me that marijuana has a very calming effect, and that it makes time seem to pass it makes your perception of time different, and everything seems to be happening slower. I don't know if that's true for everyone, but that's what he said. Well, this day that they sent that crew to work with us, they also were somewhat opinionated about how to do the work. And think again about these powerline towers. They're up to 200 and something feet tall. I think that day we were on a tower that was something like 175 foot tall. This other crew, known as the Doobie Brothers, they decided they're going to go to the top and work down to meet us. And all of us, we were like, because we always started at the bottom. That's just the way you did it. You started at the bottom, you worked your way all the way up to the top. And immediately we were like, this is not a good idea. And we tried to talk them out of it. Our foreman tried to talk them out of it, but they, thought they knew best. So here they go. They're up to the top. They're like 75 to 100 feet above us working. When you're doing this work on a power line tower, you have a belt, and that safety belt hooks into D-rings on a belt that's around your waist. And if you're belted off with that, you're not going to fall off. So that's one of the safety precautions. You would always wear gloves, you had work boots, and you would wear a hard hat. So I'm working away. These guys are up there working, and they were dropping stuff. The bolts that are on these power line towers, I think they're 3/4 of an inch is the size of the bolts. That's like how big around the bolts are, or it's either how big across or how big around. They're like a bigger bolt. They're probably like as big as your thumb, a little bigger than your thumb. And we're down here working, and here come these like 1 to 4 inch bolts whizzing by us, falling all around us, and we keep screaming at them, you got to stop dropping these bolts. We're still down here working. And they had probably smoked some marijuana that morning. I don't know. But they all seemed to be out of sorts and they weren't safe. Well, one of them dropped a wrench, and that wrench hit me. And that wrench hit me like in the back on the shoulder. It didn't kill me, obviously. It damaged like some muscle. I had to go to the doctor, and they said I had like muscle damage, and they prescribed muscle relaxers. But I thought about it later, and the reason I thought of this as a near-death experience is 2 other tools that we often had in our tool belt and we used all the time. So one was called a spud wrench. And what a spud wrench is it was a large wrench. It's probably about 12 to 16 inches long. I'm not exactly sure. And I think it was either iron or steel. It's probably steel, hardened steel. And it had a wrench on one end that you could actually use it fit all the bolts that we were using. They're all like most of them the same size. But it was long and it was a pointed tip on the other end. Well, the reason it had a pointed tip on the other end is we would get on these towers, and the plates where the huge steel beams came together, the crew that stood the tower up and initially bolted them together, they didn't line the plates up. And so you had to take a spud wrench, that was your first tool, and you had to get that in the hole. Instead of being a round hole that a bolt would slide through, the hole would often be like only 1/3 of the width of the bolt. So now what you had to do is you had to drive a wrench in there to get started and make the hole bigger, and the plate would start lining up. And remember, there's all this weight of this tower that's holding those plates in a twisted fashion. And then you would take what they called a bullpen. And what that was, imagine like something that's like about, I would say 2 inches around at the top, or 2 inches across at the top. And it also came to a point, and it was very heavy. It was also steel. And then once you got the hole started where you could see like the hole starting to get a little bigger and lined up, you would take a large hammer. We all had like a sledgehammer with us. It wasn't like the big sledgehammer that you would go outside and use. It was a shorter one, but it still was a pretty heavy hammer, probably, 4 pounds, like a 4-pound hammer or about that size. And then once you got that bullpen in, you would drive that bullpen in to line up the plate. Then you could get all your bolts in the holes, and you could finish putting that plate together properly. So we had a spud wrench, a bullpen, and like a 4-pound hammer. All of these were tools that if that fell, the spud wrench would impale you. Wherever it hits you, if the point hits you, it probably would go deep inside your body. If the bullpen hit you and it was turned the right way, it would go in. It probably wouldn't go in as far because it was shorter and it got fat quicker, like there was a taper on it. And then imagine the 4-pound hammer. I was thinking, what if you were sitting there working and you get hot and a hard hat has a band inside the hard hat, and that band's around your hairline all day, and you're sweating and that band starts aggravating you, and you would take it off every once in a while, and you'd have to like scratch your head because you just get irritated by a hard hat being on your head. And so I was thinking, so here's this guy, he's 100 feet above me. He just so happened to drop a wrench that was, 12 inches long. It was like one of those, they look like a plated metal, and they're very shiny, and they're steel as well, but they got round ends on them because the end of the wrench just fits over a nut or a bolt head. But imagine if he dropped the other tool and I had my hard hat off because my hard hat was bugging my head. That could have easily happened. And so I thought about that later many times, like, what was wrong with us? Why did we ever let those guys who were known as the Doobie Brothers go up and work 100 feet over our head when they were obviously not in their right mind and didn't have their right senses? So I count that as another near miss in my life, that somebody dropped a wrench from 100 feet. And I'm just glad it wasn't the hammer, the bullpen, or the spud wrench, because one of those could have done some serious damage. So when I look at this quilt and I take a look and see this crossroads block once the quilt is finished, that's what I'm going to think of. I'm going to think of crossing paths with people who had a different set of values, a different work ethic, a totally different perspective, because they told people that they worked better and they were more productive and they got more done when they were high. And I don't know how that can be true, but that's what they thought. So it's not to, be discriminating against people or trashing people, but I personally don't think being under the influence of anything and working, they don't go together. It's just not safe, and especially in a construction environment where obviously you're using tools that can hurt somebody very seriously. So that's my lesson that I learned is you shouldn't accept unsafe circumstances. If someone's trying to impose upon you unsafe circumstances in your work environment, you should just say, no, I'm not going to do it. We went along with it because we couldn't seem to convince them. But we really probably should have went down, got on the phone with the job site foreman and raised our concerns. And, that's a lesson learned. Don't work in unsafe conditions. For the crossroads block, I cut the pieces that are listed under cutting instructions. And you can see these here from the country and dusty fabrics. However, if you look at the block's instructions to make the block on page 3, you'll notice that we're going to take some of these pieces that we initially cut as squares, and we're going to cut those into halves or quarters. And so on the back of these pieces, we could draw a line, or we can just put our ruler corner to corner. And you'll notice that the first one we're cutting in step number 1 is we're going to take fabric piece B. We just want to make sure we use the right one because one gets cut once, the other one gets cut in quarters. So fabric piece B is a 3-inch square, and there are 2 of those. And we're going to cut those in half basically, and we're doing that cut corner to corner. So you can do a line if you like. I'm just going to lay the ruler corner to corner and make the cut. Now, the other piece that we're going to cut is fabric piece C. This is mentioned in step 2. And notice that fabric piece C is the 5 1/4 inch square of the dusty fabric. In this case, we're actually going to cut this diagonally or corner to corner on both of those. So what I'm going to do, instead of drawing a line, I'm just going to lay this on here. And then what I'm going to try to do is not move the fabric when I move the ruler. I can just do my cut without drawing the lines. The lines can be helpful, and certainly one can do that, but you can also do it without drawing the lines. So now that we've cut the squares into halves or quarters, we can lay these pieces out in the arrangement that corresponds to how our block is going to go together. Looking at page 3 of the instructions for making this block, you can see that when we go to join the pieces together, that we're going to do this in units. You kind of have to look at the block in a slanted fashion, and you'll see that we have squares and triangles that go together to form like that top unit, and then the middle unit is 3 squares with 2 triangles on the ends, and then there's a repeating on the bottom of what's on the top half. So I'm going to join these together in units as we see on page 3. Now I'm going to get started with this top unit. When we join these triangles to these squares, thinking of just that first unit, we want the bottom edge of the triangle to align with the bottom edge of the square, and that little pointed corner will stick up above the square on the other side. That's okay because we need that 1/4 inch sticking up for our seam allowance that we're going to have when we join that very top triangle to the top of this unit. And here we can see the 2 triangles joined to the square, and you see those 2 little extra corners sticking up above the top edge, and that's what we expect. Now as we're joining these outer triangles onto the end of these squares, it's important to get even spacing where the little point of the triangle sticks over evenly on each side of the square. You might even choose to measure this if you want to get it exact. If we don't get these evenly spaced, when we go to square our block at the end, we may find that we're short on one side or the other of this where this triangle joined to the square. So now you can see that we have all the units in the middle put together, and here's that middle unit. You can see how that ends up looking. And then again, we have the almost top and almost bottom as it look the same. So now we have the other little triangle that goes on the end here on both of these outside units. I'm going to join those, and then I'll have 3 units that I can join together to form the entire block. When we're laying this triangle on this other unit, we want it to be equally, distributed, spaced here on the ends. And I'm just measuring that because some people have a really good eye for how something looks when it's even. I'm not so sure that that's the case with me, of being able to just guess it. So I'm just going to check it. Okay, those are very close to the same. So now you can see what one of those lower upper units looks like with the end triangle joined together. And now I have 3 units. So I'll join these 3 units together to form the entire block. And here we'll want to pay close attention to where the blocks around the center line up right. We want those lines to be corresponding to the other squares. Okay, so we have our block all joined together. I'm going to press it and starch it lightly so I can do the squaring. Okay, so there is our finished crossroads block. I think it turned out real nice. When I see this quilt in the future, once I get it all done, this is definitely going to make me think of crossing paths with people who didn't work safe and almost cost me my life. So that completes all 9 sampler blocks in the My 9 Lives Quilt Sampler. In the next video, I'm going to move on to rows, sashing, and borders. And I have a separate document that outlines all the instructions for that, which I'll make available in the video description of the next video. And so we'll see this quilt start coming together, and it's going to be, I think, a beautiful quilt. And I hope you enjoyed watching me demonstrate making block number 9, the crossroads block, and hearing my last near-death experience that I was going to share. And if you have any comments you would like to share, please post those with the video. Give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so if you like videos like this. In the meantime, till I continue with the next video about rows, sashing, and borders, I'm wishing you happy sewing and beautiful finishes.